So once you have a portrait database loaded into Pictavo, it's time to start flowing portraits onto your pages. Now, the nice thing about Pictavo is that you can actually flow empty portrait grids onto your pages and customize those to use as placeholders while you're designing the rest of your book. So I'm going to do that right now so that you can see how that process works. So if we head over here and click on our portrait icon, that's going to drop just a default size portrait grid onto your page. Over here in our portrait grid settings is where we get to customize what this portrait grid is actually going to look like. First things first, I can change the number of rows and the number of columns. I can change where the names are going to fall, how they're going to look. I can also change the spacing in between the portraits. Right now my portrait grid is pretty big and there's not a lot of room to spare, so I'm not going to be able to change much about my spacing. However, if I go ahead and grab one of these handles and size my portrait grid down a little bit, that gives me a little bit more freedom and I can change the spacing in between my portraits. Now, if I go ahead and click on this text settings menu, I can actually change the font in here and the size of my portrait names. I can also change the typeface color, and I can change whether it's going to be first name, last name, or last name, comma, first name. Now, another thing that you'll notice in these portrait settings menus is the option to remember my changes for future portrait flows. If I check this box, that means moving forward in my book, any portrait flow that I put on a page is going to have these same settings, so I don't have to try to remember what I did 4 pages ago. Another very popular feature in Pictavo is the ability to get rid of some of our portrait spaces. We're going to go over here to the portrait grid and we're just going to double click. We're going to use these subtraction buttons to actually remove these placeholders so that we can put a different image here, or we can put some sort of snippet or headline here. Go ahead and deselect, and then you can kind of see what your portrait grid is going to look like without those portraits in it. If you decide maybe that wasn't a good choice and you want them back, go ahead and double click again and just use the plus signs to put those portraits back. Deselect, select the grid again, and then we're going to be back in portrait flow settings. Here in portrait flow settings, you'll see choose flow group. That's how we actually get portraits into the grid that we've created. Depending on how you uploaded your database, you may have homerooms or grades. I just have one big class, so I'm going to go ahead and choose that to flow. Now, Pictavo is always going to be communicating with you about the fact that what you're doing might affect portraits on another page, and you're always going to want to go back and double check and make sure that nothing got readjusted without you realizing it. So there we have portraits into our portrait grid. One more thing that I want to show you over in the art palette is the ability to crop your portraits into a shape. Now go ahead and go into shapes and you can just choose a shape, drag that onto your portrait grid, and that's going to crop all of your portraits into the shape that you just dropped. Now it's really easy to get super excited and feel really creative and maybe choose shapes that don't lend themselves the best to cropping a portrait grid. So just be really mindful of the fact that these are someone's portrait in a yearbook and make good design choices.